There is a moment, quiet and unglamorous, when an avoidant finally understands that the person they once dismissed as too trusting, too hopeful, too easily fooled actually saw through them the entire time. It doesn't arrive with fireworks, it arrives somewhere ordinary, in the middle of an unrelated thought, and it lands with a specific kind of disorientation because it dismantles a story the avoidant has been quietly telling themselves for a very long time. That story casts the other person as naive, as someone who simply didn't understand what was happening beneath the surface, as someone whose hope and patience were signs of not knowing better. Realizing that story was false, that the other person understood exactly what was happening and chose to stay anyway, out of something closer to grace than ignorance, changes everything the avoidant thought they knew about how the relationship actually unfolded. If the listener has ever wondered whether the avoidant secretly believed they were getting away with something, whether the patience and hope on display were mistaken for blindness rather than recognized as strength, this exploration is going to confirm exactly how deep that misunderstanding usually runs and how much it costs an avoidant once it finally corrects itself. To understand why this realization lands with such particular force, it helps to understand the specific narrative avoidants construct about the people who love them well. Because avoidant behavior depends so heavily on going unnoticed, on withdrawal reading as mystery rather than fear, on distance reading as depth rather than avoidance, the avoidant needs to believe, at least on some level, that their behavior isn't fully legible to the people experiencing it. This belief protects them. If the other person doesn't fully understand what's happening, then the avoidant's actions can't really be judged as deliberate. Confusion becomes a kind of shield. As long as the other person seems uncertain, seems hopeful despite inconsistency, seems willing to interpret coldness charitably, the avoidant can continue operating without confronting the full weight of what their behavior actually communicates. This is where naivety becomes such a convenient explanation for the avoidant to reach for. If the person's staying, hoping, showing up again and again despite inconsistent effort, is simply naive, simply hasn't figured out the pattern yet, then their continued presence doesn't require the avoidant to reckon with anything. It can be filed away as a temporary condition, one that will eventually resolve itself once the other person either grows wiser or gives up entirely. What the avoidant rarely considers, at least not while the relationship is active, is a third possibility, one far more uncomfortable than either wisdom eventually dawning or patience eventually running out. That possibility is that the other person understood the pattern with painful clarity from very early on and chose, deliberately, to remain anyway, not out of confusion, but out of hope, out of love, out of a willingness to extend grace towards someone still learning how to be close to another person. It's worth pausing here to speak directly to the listener who has lived this exact experience, who has been quietly, privately aware of every inconsistency, every withdrawal, every moment of coldness disguised as busyness or distraction, while still choosing to stay present with warmth rather than becoming bitter or combative. That awareness was never naivety. Seeing a pattern clearly and choosing to respond with patience rather than punishment requires far more emotional sophistication than either blind hope or immediate departure would have required. It is a much harder thing to understand someone's fear and still choose gentleness than it is to simply not notice the fear at all. If part of what's being described here feels uncomfortably familiar, that discomfort is worth sitting with, because it likely means the description is accurate. The moment this realization dawns on the avoidant tends to arrive through small, specific pieces of evidence rather than one dramatic confession. Perhaps a comment resurfaces in memory, something the other person said months or years earlier that at the time seemed offhand or unremarkable, but in retrospect reveals a level of understanding that couldn't have existed without genuine insight into exactly what was happening. Perhaps it arrives through distance itself, through the avoidant finally having enough space from the relationship to reconsider specific moments without the defensive fog that coloured them at the time. Whatever the specific trigger, the realization tends to unfold the same way once it starts, retroactively recasting the entire relationship in a completely different light. This recasting is significant because it forces the avoidant to reconsider not just what the other person knew, but what that knowledge implies about their own transparency. If the other person understood the avoidance patterns clearly, that means the avoidant's carefully managed distance, their studied unavailability, their performance of composure and self-sufficiency was never as impenetrable as they believed it to be. Someone was watching closely enough, cared enough, paid enough attention to see through the performance to whatever was actually happening underneath. This is deeply unsettling for someone whose entire relational strategy depends on maintaining an illusion of opacity, of being difficult to read, of keeping their inner world sufficiently hidden that no one could accurately map its contours. Discovering that someone did map it anyway, quietly, and without ever announcing the achievement, undermines a sense of control the avoidant relied on more than they ever consciously acknowledged. There's a particular flavour of humiliation embedded in this discovery that differs from other kinds of avoidant regret. It isn't simply about having behaved poorly, it's about having been transparent while believing themselves opaque, about having performed a role that fooled almost no one while assuming it fooled everyone. Consider how disorienting it must be to realize that the careful choreography of mixed signals, the strategic unavailability, the practiced indifference, none of it obscured anything meaningful from someone who was paying real attention. What felt from the inside like a sophisticated defense system reads from the outside as something far more transparent and far more ordinary. A set of predictable, almost textbook avoidant behaviors that anyone with enough patience and attentiveness could eventually learn to recognize. This recognition also forces a reckoning with a specific kind of shame around having underestimated someone. Most people don't enjoy discovering they misjudged another person's intelligence or perceptiveness, but for an avoidant, this particular misjudgment carries extra weight, because it intersects with their broader tendency to view emotional attunement as a form of weakness. If hopefulness and patience were never signs of naivety, but were instead signs of clear-eyed emotional intelligence, then the entire hierarchy the avoidant relied on, the one that placed their own guardedness above the other person's openness, collapses. The avoidant assumed detachment made them the more perceptive one in the relationship, the one who saw clearly while the other person operated on hope and assumption. Realizing the opposite was closer to true, that hope and clarity coexisted the entire time in the person they underestimated, is a difficult hierarchy to rebuild from. It's worth exploring what specifically made the avoidant so confident in their misjudgment for so long. Part of the answer lies in how differently avoidants and more securely attached people tend to express awareness. An avoidant, upon recognizing a painful pattern, typically responds by withdrawing further, by using the recognition as ammunition for distance, treating clarity as confirmation that leaving is justified. Someone with more capacity for emotional endurance, more willingness to hold complexity without needing to resolve it through withdrawal, often responds to that same recognition completely differently, choosing instead to remain present, to keep extending warmth, to continue believing in the possibility of change, even while seeing the pattern with complete accuracy. Because the avoidant has no internal template for this kind of response, mistaking it for confusion rather than choice becomes almost automatic. It's simply the only framework they have available for interpreting continued presence in the face of visible dysfunction. There's something worth naming plainly for anyone who has lived this dynamic and wondered, at times, whether staying despite clear-eyed awareness made them foolish rather than strong. It did not. Recognizing a person's fear, understanding exactly what drives their withdrawal, and choosing compassion over immediate departure is not the same as being fooled by them. It is possible to see someone completely and still choose gentleness, still choose patience, still hold space for the possibility that they might eventually meet that gentleness with something more consistent. This choice doesn't require ignorance. It requires a kind of emotional generosity that avoidants trapped inside their own defensive patterns often cannot imagine, let alone recognize when they encounter it directly. Once this realization fully settles, it tends to trigger a secondary wave of discomfort, centered on all the specific moments the avoidant assumed were successfully concealed. Every carefully worded excuse for distance, every deflection dressed up as busyness, every strategic vagueness deployed to avoid a direct conversation, gets re-examined through the lens of someone who apparently understood exactly what was happening the entire time. This re-examination is uncomfortable, precisely because it strips away the retroactive comfort of having at least been clever, of having at least successfully managed the narrative, even while behaving poorly. Discovering that the management never actually worked, that the other person simply chose not to name what they saw, replaces the comfort of perceived cleverness with the much less comfortable reality of having been seen through consistently, without ever being told. This is where an important distinction becomes worth exploring: the difference between someone staying because they didn't know better, and someone staying because they chose to extend patience despite knowing exactly what they were dealing with. The avoidant's earlier assumption collapses one specific fear into a much larger, more complicated truth. Someone who stays despite clear understanding isn't operating from a deficit of awareness. They're operating from a surplus of hope, a belief that people are capable of more than their current behavior suggests, a willingness to hold space for growth that hasn't happened yet. This is a fundamentally different and in many ways far more generous position than naivety would have represented, and recognizing the difference requires the avoidant to reconsider not just what happened, but what kind of person they were actually dealing with the entire time. There's a particular grief that accompanies this recognition too, separate from any romantic longing that might or might not still exist. It's grief over having wasted an opportunity that was, in retrospect, more available than the avoidant ever realized. If the other person understood the pattern clearly and chose to stay anyway, out of genuine hope rather than confusion, that means the relationship had more real potential for change than the avoidant assumed, while they were busy protecting themselves from vulnerability. The naivety narrative was, in a strange way, comforting to the avoidant, because it implied the relationship's failure was somewhat inevitable. A simple matter of one person eventually understanding what the other had known all along. Realizing that understanding was present from early on removes this comfort entirely. It means the failure wasn't inevitable. It means there was a real, aware, willing partner extending real patience, and the avoidant's own defenses, not the other person's ignorance, were what ultimately determined how the relationship unfolded. For the listener who recognizes this exact dynamic, who watched an avoidant partner or connection slowly come to understand, whether through direct conversation or through quiet distance, that their patterns had never gone unnoticed, there is something worth holding on to here, beyond the satisfaction of being finally understood correctly. The clarity that existed the entire time, the ability to see someone's fear and respond with steadiness, rather than either denial or cruelty, was never a liability. It was, and remains, one of the more difficult emotional skills a person can develop. The capacity to hold accurate perception and genuine compassion simultaneously, without needing one to cancel out the other. Most people struggle with exactly this balance their entire lives, tilting either toward naive optimism that ignores red flags entirely, or toward guarded cynicism that refuses closeness altogether. Managing to hold both accurate perception and open-hearted patience at once is rare, and it deserves to be recognized as the strength it always was, regardless of whether the avoidant on the receiving end of it ever manages to see it clearly themselves. There's a physical, almost visceral quality to how this recognition tends to land. One worth describing carefully because it distinguishes this particular realization from milder forms of regret. It often arrives with a genuine jolt, a sudden reordering of memory that feels less like gentle reconsideration and more like watching a photograph develop into an image entirely different from what was expected. The avoidant might be recalling a specific conversation, one they filed away years earlier as evidence of the other person's innocence or confusion, and suddenly notice for the first time a particular phrase or pause that couldn't possibly have come from someone who didn't understand exactly what was happening. This kind of retroactive recognition tends to cascade once it begins, pulling other memories along with it, each one requiring its own uncomfortable reinterpretation. It's worth exploring how this cascade interacts with the avoidant's broader relationship to memory itself, because avoidants often curate their own recollections in ways that protect their self-image without them fully realizing they're doing it. Painful or unflattering memories get softened over time, edited slightly with each retelling, until the version that remains bears only a partial resemblance to what actually happened. This particular realization disrupts that editing process because it doesn't simply add new information. It recontextualizes information that was already present, forcing memories that had been carefully softened back into sharper focus. The avoidant cannot simply forget this new understanding the way they might forget an inconvenient detail, because it changes the meaning of dozens of other memories simultaneously, memories that can't all be re-edited quickly enough to restore the previous, more comfortable version of events. There's something worth naming about how this realization tends to interact with the avoidant's understanding of trust more broadly, because it often produces a strange kind of retroactive gratitude tangled up with the discomfort. Understanding that someone saw through the avoidance defenses and chose to remain anyway, chose not to weaponize that understanding, chose not to expose it publicly or use it to manipulate the relationship's dynamics, reveals a level of integrity the avoidant rarely extended in return. This is an uncomfortable asymmetry to sit with. The avoidant, so preoccupied with protecting their own image, so quick to withdraw at the first sign of vulnerability, now has to reconcile with the fact that the other person held real, potentially damaging insight into their behavior and chose restraint anyway, out of what can only be described as genuine care rather than any obligation to do so. This reconciliation often prompts a broader reconsideration of what respect actually looked like throughout the relationship and who was actually demonstrating it. The avoidant likely spent considerable energy believing that their own withdrawal, their own guardedness, constituted a form of respect for the relationship's boundaries, a way of not overwhelming the other person with too much emotional intensity too quickly. Once the naivety narrative dissolves, this self-perception becomes harder to maintain. If the other person understood the avoidance patterns clearly and still chose patience over confrontation, still chose warmth over accusation, that behavior represents a far more consistent and demanding form of respect than anything the avoidant managed to offer in return. Respect, it turns out, wasn't demonstrated through distance. It was demonstrated through the willingness to see clearly and remain kind anyway, something the avoidant rarely managed even when the roles were reversed. It's worth examining too how this specific realization tends to reshape an avoidant's approach to future relationships, at least for those capable of genuine reflection rather than simple avoidance of the discomfort altogether. Having once assumed that emotional perceptiveness in a partner signaled either naivety or manipulation, something to be managed or exploited rather than respected, the avoidant who truly absorbs this lesson often begins approaching new relationships with a different, more cautious humility. They become less quick to assume that a partner's patience or hopefulness reflects a lack of understanding, more willing to consider that steadiness in the face of difficulty might actually represent clear-eyed strength rather than blindness. This shift, when it happens, rarely gets attributed publicly to the specific relationship that prompted it. It tends to arrive quietly, folded into new behavior without any acknowledgement of its origin, which means the person whose patience originally taught this lesson may never receive credit for having done so. This absence of credit deserves direct acknowledgement here because it's one of the more frustrating aspects of watching someone grow from a distance or hearing about that growth secondhand through mutual connections. The avoidant's eventual capacity to recognize and appreciate emotional clarity in a future partner doesn't retroactively benefit the person who first demonstrated that same clarity and received so little acknowledgement for it in return. Growth prompted by one relationship frequently gets applied to the next relationship instead, an uncomfortable but common pattern across many kinds of personal development. Understanding this in advance can help temper the expectation that recognizing one's own naivety projection will necessarily translate into any kind of direct repair or acknowledgement toward the person who originally endured it. There's a specific irony worth sitting with here as well, one that ties back to the earlier discussion of power and perception. For much of the relationship, the avoidant likely believed that maintaining emotional distance gave them a kind of protective advantage and ability to exit cleanly whenever necessary, without becoming too entangled to leave. What this eventual realization reveals is that the entanglement was never as one-sided as the avoidant assumed. Someone who understands another person's fear that clearly, who reads their patterns with that much accuracy, has already formed a bond deep enough to require real vulnerability, whether the avoidant recognized it as vulnerability at the time or not. Being understood that completely is its own kind of intimacy, regardless of whether the person doing the understanding ever announced it directly. The avoidant, so focused on avoiding vulnerability themselves, failed to notice that they had already become fully known by someone who simply chose not to make a spectacle of that knowledge. For the listener sitting with this recognition from their own side of a similar story, there's something worth considering about what it means to have held that kind of clarity without ever needing it acknowledged in order for it to matter. The understanding itself was real, independent of whether the avoidant ever confirmed it, independent of whether patience was ever rewarded with consistency, independent of whether the relationship ultimately survived long enough for any of this recognition to change its outcome. Seeing someone clearly, holding that clarity with compassion rather than resentment, and choosing not to weaponize what was understood is a complete act in itself, one that doesn't require external validation to have been meaningful, real, and, in its own quiet way, genuinely brave. It's worth exploring one more layer here, concerning the specific role that pride plays in how long this realization takes to fully arrive. Pride is often what keeps an avoidant clinging to the naivety narrative long after mounting evidence should have dismantled it. Admitting that someone saw through the performance requires admitting the performance failed, and failure of this particular kind cuts against the avoidant's need to feel competent, controlled, and difficult to read. This is part of why the realization so often arrives slowly rather than all at once, in fragments spread across months or years rather than a single decisive moment of clarity. Pride resists sudden collapse. It tends to erode gradually, worn down by accumulating evidence that eventually becomes too consistent to keep dismissing. This gradual erosion often follows a recognizable pattern, one worth describing because it may resonate for anyone who has watched an avoidant slowly come around to a truth they spent a long time resisting. At first, there's simple denial and insistence, even if only internal, that the other person really didn't understand what was happening, that any apparent insight was coincidental or exaggerated in hindsight. Then comes a kind of grudging acknowledgement, an admission that maybe some things were noticed, but a continued insistence that the full picture was still misunderstood. Only much later, often after considerable time and distance, does the fuller recognition arrive. the understanding that the clarity was neither partial nor coincidental, but complete and deliberate, extended not out of confusion but out of choice. There's something worth saying about how this staged recognition mirrors other forms of psychological defense more broadly, because it isn't unique to this specific scenario. People generally resist conclusions that require them to significantly revise their self-concept, preferring instead to absorb difficult information in smaller, more manageable doses that don't demand immediate comprehensive change. This is part of why direct confrontation so rarely produces the full recognition an avoidant eventually reaches on their own. Being told directly that someone saw through their patterns invites immediate defensiveness, an argument to be won rather than a truth to be absorbed. Arriving at that same understanding gradually through private reflection rather than external accusation tends to bypass this defensiveness precisely because there's no argument to win, no accuser to counter, nothing except the quiet accumulation of memory, eventually outweighing the comfort of denial. It's also worth considering how this realization interacts with an avoidant's broader capacity for humility, because the two are more closely linked than they might initially appear. Genuine humility requires accepting that one's self-perception can be inaccurate, that the story someone tells about their own behavior doesn't always match how that behavior actually registers to others. Avoidants, whose entire defensive structure often depends on maintaining a very specific, controlled self-image, tend to struggle with this kind of humility more than most. Not because they're incapable of it, but because their psychological survival has depended for so long on not examining the gap between self-image and reality too closely. This particular realization, understanding that they were never as opaque as they believed, forces exactly that examination, whether they're ready for it or not. For anyone listening who wonders whether an avoidant partner or former connection ever truly understood what they were dealing with, whether their patience was ever recognized for what it actually represented rather than dismissed as simple hopefulness, it's worth remembering that recognition, even when it arrives, rarely announces itself in real time. It tends to unfold privately, slowly, often long after any opportunity to voice it directly has already passed. This doesn't mean the recognition never happens. It simply means it happens on a timeline entirely outside anyone else's control, arriving eventually, quietly, and often without ever being spoken aloud to the very person who made it possible in the first place. What makes this particular realization so quietly significant, more than most others an avoidant eventually confronts, is how directly it challenges their sense of who held the power in the relationship. For as long as the naivety narrative held, the avoidant could believe they were the one managing the situation, the one controlling perception, the one operating with more insight than their partner. Once that narrative dissolves, the power dynamic reveals itself as something entirely different than what the avoidant assumed. The person who stayed wasn't the less perceptive one in the relationship. In many cases, they were the only one brave enough to see clearly and remain anyway, while the avoidant spent the entire time hiding from a clarity they weren't yet ready to face about themselves, a clarity that had, in truth, been sitting quietly beside them the whole time, patiently waiting, unnoticed, to finally and completely be recognized at long last.